We put together probably somewhere between 5 and 10K of our own money into this and put some major life milestones on hold to give it a shot. And we started in that garage with a 3D printer and a vacuum pump.
Welcome to Rockets and Radars podcast, a podcast for early stage space and defense founders. The idea is to get Series A founders from either space or defense industry and let them to tell story of their startup or company from the very start until the present. So you can get the knowledge from people that actually have done it before. I want to make this as informal as possible. Think of it as being in a pub and talking with a guest there. So I hope you will really enjoy the conversation. The first episode, which are going to listen right now, is going to be with Joshua Western from Spaceforge.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Before we deep dive into this episode, I just wanted to share a very small disclaimer with you for both of those listening and watching. So the introduction that you just listened to or saw was made after the third episode of this podcast, which means that the quality of the video and audio of this particular episode is not going to be as great as the introduction. Just so you know, just to be transparent with you. As you can see, the power of iterations and the philosophy of iterating every time when we release a new episode is a core of this podcast, which means that if you have any thoughts on what to improve on from the format, questions, or flow, or even quality of either video or audio, please let me know. So thanks all for sharing your feedback and enjoy this episode. For our listeners, if you have any drink by your side, feel free to open it. I'll try to make this as literally a friendly conversation, which I think are missing from the industry, both from Europe, but also globally. There are a lot of very nice, actually, conferences and very nice panel discussions all over the world. But what I personally have been missing also is those informal conversation after work where we just deep dive into very specific topics and stories and just look into that. And literally with the hope to see what happens. And usually those best conversations come from the beer conversation. So let's get into the story. So for those listening who may not be familiar with Spaceforge, could you give us a quick snapshot of what you guys are doing in space and why it's so important?
Happy to do so. Spaceforge really is a materials company first and a space company second. What I mean by that is we as a company are focused on the production of next generation compound semiconductor substrates. What those are the crystals that basically make up computer chips. As a company, we are already doing that here on Earth, but our main goal is to be doing that in space. The reason we want to do it in space is because you get a profound benefit in the purity of the semiconductor crystals by up to 3 to 5 orders of magnitude improvement compared to what's currently possible today. So that's where obviously the space part comes in of what we do. And as a company, we balance both the semiconductor manufacturing and the spacecraft engineering to create our micro-orbiting factories, Forge stars, to go to low Earth orbit and produce these advanced crystals. Before at the end of that production run, we then deploy our re-entry technology called Prydwin, best described as Mary Poppins from space. It is a large deployable umbrella, which effectively allows us to float back from orbit down to the ground. Take the semiconductors out, put them into a terrestrial semiconductor fab back here on Earth, and then pretty much rinse and repeat, or as we say, launch, forge, return, repeat.
By the way, just to mention for the audience, Spaceforge raised one of the Europe's largest ever seed round for a space tech company. So congratulations, guys, so far. Your journey is very inspiring, and I hope this story inspires other founders that might be just starting out, but maybe those also that have gone through a Series A already. Anyway, let's get into the very beginning of the story. First things first, how did you come with an idea to go for Spaceforge?
Spaceforge really came to be for 2 reasons. And what can't be understated is that the technologies that sit behind Spaceforge were brought to me by my co-founder, Andrew Bacon. He is the engineering mastermind behind everything that we're doing at Spaceforge. We were working together at Thales Alenia Space, which feels like a lifetime ago now, but was, 4 and a bit years ago. And And with
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
so Andrew was responsible for the advanced concepts team. So he was the guy that used to come up with the crazy ideas, mining asteroids, habitats on the moon, how much would people pay if they could play Quidditch on the International Space Station, which worryingly was actually one of the business cases that closed fastest that he ever brought me. My role at the time was I was in business development at Thales, but had also been seconded out into the UK Space Agency for a number of years, where I looked after national security, space weather, did some bits in product development and eventually strategy, where I wrote part of what became the country's first national space program. Now, one of the reasons why we do Spaceforge is basically we were bored. I did not make a very good civil servant. I told the minister too much what I thought. I was somewhat tired of big corporate. I was in a position where my team lead was 20 years older than me and my manager was 20 years older than him. So I was literally waiting for this guy to retire so that the other guy got promoted so that I might get promoted. And I realized I could not do that for the rest of my life. And I could see 40 years pass me by in a flash. I realized I'd be stood at whatever the retirement age is by that point and go, what the bloody hell did I do with my life? So that was reason number one. The far more profound reason why we started Spaceforge is because Andy and I needed to do something that actually mattered and actually contributed. We were certainly working on some very cool projects and some very cool technologies. There are only so many years in a row you can work on whatever is a 10% improvement to a geostationary telecom satellite. It gets quite boring. And space also has a problem where it says that it solves problems back here on Earth. Most of the time it doesn't. It just points out that those challenges exist. So if we take Earth observation and climate change, for example, Earth observation points out that there are problems on Earth. Oil spills in the Gulf, deforestation in the Amazon, wildfires in Greece, whatever it is. It can point out that those problems are, and it can certainly help get people to those areas. But the solution to those challenges are still very much on the ground. Making things in space is the first opportunity we've had to actually use the space environment to produce something which, when returned to Earth, directly addresses some of the most pressing issues of our generation.
Okay, very fascinating and very interesting perspective that you have. Before we get into further within the story, I'm very curious from the personal side on how did you get into the space industry in the first place as a person?
This is where I feel like an imposter in this industry, because I was very lucky and do not fit the typical trajectory of somebody that is going into the space industry. So I graduated in politics back in the same year when Tim Peake was selected for his mission to the International Space Station. So the second British astronaut that we've had and the first British ESA astronaut. That news article at some point in 2014 was the catalyst as to me. That's how I found out that the UK even had a space industry. Up until that point, I assumed you basically had to be in America and you'd go work at NASA. And I assumed that was what the industry was. Very typical of the UK that we've got this fantastic industry that nobody ever talks about. We're getting better at it. And at the time, I only had one job offer, and that was to join the British Army. And I wrote to the CEO of Thales Alenia Space in the UK, which was quite a fresh organization, and I asked him for a job interview. And he gave me a job interview. And it is really as prosaic as that. I reached out and that's how I got my first job in the industry, which contract change notices that were submitted by Thales into the European Space Agency. And that was my first ever job. And it paid me £2,000 more a year than I would have had as a commissioned officer in the army. So as a graduate saddled with debt, I couldn't think of anything better than what that extra 2K would allow me to do. And that's how I got into it, basically on the premise that I think space is cool. And I didn't know I was going to have the opportunity to do it.
What would you do if you didn't have that revelation?
That's a question I think about often. I have no idea. I think I probably still would have ended up in space by hook or by crook. Like all children, fascinated with it growing up. Always had an interest in it. Always enjoyed astronomy, but just didn't choose the subjects that would allow me to go into the engineering pathway or the science pathway. What's really important about space, of course, is it is intensely political. So I spend a lot of time doing a lot of politics, both in the UK, across Europe and globally, around the strategic importance of both space and semiconductors, but also certainly on a company level, why Spaceforge as well. If I wasn't going to do any of that, then I probably would have been a restaurant critic.
Okay, I didn't expect that one. Okay. Okay, that's a big one. Anyway, just for the people that are thinking about space in the same way, which means that they are very passionate about it and they would like to end up in the industry at some point, what advice would you give them if their background is not necessarily from engineering or space science? Those people that ask me those questions are usually those that had a career, but they didn't like it and they
Yeah.
really want to get into the space industry, but they don't know how.
If you're in a different engineering discipline, apply. Spaceforge, we've got people that have built synthesizers, UAVs. We've got people that worked at Aston Martin. We've got people that worked in F1. I mean, really, the major difference between other engineering disciplines involving hardware and space is basically the level of cleanliness of the room and the suit that you're wearing to put the hardware together. Most of it still follows the same rules. You still put things in the right place. You still test it. You just put it in a much harsher environment than you might typically with other products that you might engineer. And we've had people join us, as I say, from organizations like that. We've recently had 2 engineers join us from Dyson. We really don't specify, apart from some very niche roles, that you require the space experience to move into it. So we're very happy to take sort of mid-career engineering. I think when you're going for a role that's not engineering, like all of mine have been, I've done government affairs, I've done marketing, I've done contracts, the roles which other industries have that are the business side of other industries, space has them all as well. The benefit now is there are far more space companies active today than there were even 5 or 6 years ago.
Fortunately, also in Europe, as for example, Spaceforge. Okay, awesome. Let's get into Spaceforge then. This is a very historical thing. You bootstrapping garage in Bristol. Can you take us back into those very early days? How was it to bootstrap in such an unconventional setting?
We were using, so the garage was Andy's, at the time, girlfriend, now wife's garage. So that was a very strange conversation that he had to have with her about, that garage that you're not really using. I'd like to turn it into a lab, please. And also you have to remember, in America, they talk endlessly about garage startups. If you've seen a garage in America, it is enormous. I've seen flats in Berlin half the size of a garage in America. So when we think about a European garage, you could barely get a Mini or a Polo into it. So really small, constrained space that we're trying to do this in. So we had access to the garage, which is where we put our own money into it. And I was working on a fold-out table in my flat in a different part of Bristol, writing the business plan. I had a conversation with my now wife on the way into the supermarket, and I let her know, oh, by the way, I'm actually going to have a go at trying to start a company, and I'm going to do it with Andy from work. And to be honest, that really calmed her down, because she was wondering why on earth I was spending so much time with Andy after work and not really talking about it. So she was like, oh, okay, you're starting a company. Cool. Okay, that makes way more sense. And I took some money out of our house deposit that we'd been saving for to start Spaceforge. And Andy did something similar on his side. So we put together probably somewhere between 5 and 10K of our own money into this and put some major life milestones on hold to give it a shot. And we started in that garage with a 3D printer and a vacuum pump. So we've got like a cabinet of failure and success that is the history of Spaceforge to date. And the 3D printer and a vacuum pump. And our goal was to try and develop affordable experiments to demonstrate that we could produce semiconductor plasma in as close as we could get to something that you could say was space environment for the amount of money that we had. In order to achieve that, we started 3D printing vacuum chambers. Now, if you Google 3D printing of vacuum chambers, there's very little information on how to 3D print a vacuum chamber. That's for a very good reason. It's bloody difficult and it's made out of plastic. So we did 13 prints, and on the 13th print was the time that we successfully held vacuum in that chamber. And we've got all 13 of them. I might even have one of them in my desk. If I do, actually, here it is. There you go. Just to keep me, there is
Oh, here we
iteration
go.
11. And I think that one, much earlier, that one. Can't even remember that one. Put that one
Awesome.
away in case lest I reveal all of our secrets. And Andy's got a lot more than I have, and a few of them are in that cabinet. So very difficult to 3D print vacuum chambers. It's also made out of plastic. If you're then trying to heat something to produce a plasma inside something that's plastic, it doesn't last for very long. So we very quickly melted through most of those chambers. But on the 13th, held it for long enough that we were able to demonstrate something that got some angel investors interested in the first round. And then COVID hit.
Okay, but that's what I'm very curious about. Your first source of funding, was it an angel investment or a non-dilutive grant?
So we were able to access a program from the government which required
Okay.
angel funding match. So it was called the Regional Angel Investment Accelerator, which was run by Innovate UK, as the name suggests, an innovation agency in the UK. And we were successful in bringing in 250k angel investment, which was largely SEIS, which is like the UK tax advantaged investment scheme. We then got a 100k program from Innovate UK. And then the Development Bank of Wales encouraged us to move over the bridge with another 250k about 8 weeks later.
When did you start trying to get that funding?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that one. Started looking in 2019. I'd gone part-time at Thales to be able to work on this. And graciously, they took out the moonlighting clause in the contract and said, have at it. We think you're crazy, but, go ahead. So was working part-time on it. We signed an account with a bank in Bristol called Metro Bank, but the only reason we signed a bank account with them was because they were the only bank open after 5 p.m., which was obviously when we started working on Spaceforge, because we had to finish for the day at Thales and then go and do our own stuff. So we needed a bank that was actually open when we were working. And the old manager there put me in touch with a chap called Dennis, who became one of our first investors. And he ran an angel group called Bristol Private Equity Club. And that's how we got our first angels. At the same time, I met our chair, Dr. Roger Sykes, at a local government event that was basically helping small companies learn how to pitch. They were thinking bakeries, maybe a new gym. And then I was at the end. Yes. And then I was at the end like, oh, hi, yeah, I want to go make semiconductors
A different
in
type of
space.
investors.
And
Yeah, okay,
I
fair
can
enough.
remember everybody looking at me. But at the end of that event, Roger, who's now our chair, was one of the pitching judges. And I thought he must have money because he was the only person that wore a jacket to the event. Everybody else was in a t-shirt. He was in a shirt and jacket. So I was like, this guy must have some money. So I went up to him and asked him for some. And he was like, well, unfortunately, I'm not actually an investor. He said, but I do have 40 years in the semiconductor industry. So maybe I can be helpful. And it was those two things combined in late 2019 that allowed us to get our first angel check in before the new tax year. But it is really difficult to find those first investors.
If you would start again, how would you approach it differently?
So I know what SEIS is now, which I didn't. I know about things like Angel List. I know about things like SPVs. Equally, there are entire angel groups set up in Europe and across Europe and in the UK, dedicated to the sorts of technologies that we do at Spaceforge. So you have climate tech dedicated angel groups. You have semiconductor, you have deep tech, you have space. Those things didn't really exist when we had the genesis of Spaceforge. We'd heard sort of some of the venture capital firms that might get involved with space at the time. And as you would expect, we didn't have, it's not like we had traction. It's not like we had a product or a prototype or an MVP. And all of them were like, well, come back to us when you've actually got something. And you're not two guys still wearing your other company's lanyard at an air show. Come back to us when you've actually set up. So there is an abundance of resources now that I just didn't have 5 years ago.
Okay, it's interesting. Angel groups and non-dilutive opportunities. Try to look at it locally and try to find out who is out there. That would be...
I think so, yeah. I mean, I would say what works out very well as a proxy in Europe for non-dilutive is European Space Agency funding.
Okay, super interesting. Between 2019 and 2023, You raised funding from Innovate UK, Type 1 Ventures, and also big names like George D. Whitesides from Virgin Galactic and Alan Taylor. How did you manage to get on the radar of those high-profile investors?
To listeners who are under the age of 35, I highly recommend joining the Space Generation Advisory Council, SGAC. That was very formative for me as we were working on the genesis of Spaceforge, because it gave me a network of people who were in my peer group, in my age range, that were as interested in space as I was. Now, I will also say there are just so many incredible people in that organization. I'd be sat down with somebody and I'd be like, well, tell me, how did you get into space? And they'd be like, oh, well, when I was 15, I wrote some of the landing code for the Perseverance rover. What about you? And I was like, oh, well, when I was 15, I really enjoyed playing Zelda Ocarina of Time. So there was, there are those gaps. But SGAC is an incredible network. And again, by its very nature, globally. So at one of the SGAC events that was just before the Washington, DC IAC in 2019, I was with some of that group. And a couple of those group worked for Dylan for his not-for-profit Space for Humanity. And they invited me very graciously to an evening party for Space for Humanity. So I was like, there I am. What was that in 2019? 26, 27? Invited to my first ever not-for-profit event. Got on this minibus, got taken from DC to a very nice place in Virginia. Dylan was at that event. The Whitesides were at that event. Loads of other people who are notable space investors were at that event. Everybody that was an investor that was at that event ended up investing in Spaceforge's seed round. I think it's even less personal connections. For me, it's saying yes to things. So, I said yes to going to the free conference with SGAC IAC. I said yes to the event. I actually went to the event, and then you just meet people. So it's not personal connections in the way that, you've built them up and they're a friend of the family or something like that. That's the beauty of opportunity, is if you say yes to it, incredible things can happen. And that is one of the incredible things that happened.
But on the other hand, currently there is an abundance of amazing events in space around the world. And I think now the problem might be
I would say there are certainly too many events. I don't know if there are too many opportunities.
Thanks for the clarification there. If you were a founder now, in the very beginning, how would you pick the right places and events to go to? And how do you know which one could give you the biggest upside?
Where your customers will be. That, first and foremost, I'm asked quite regularly to attend things about the space supply chain in terms of either being on a panel or attending it or exhibiting at it. The space supply chain isn't necessarily my customer. I mean, certainly satellites can use the semiconductors we produce, but also so can other industries. And there are loads, and there are just so many events where all that happens is space talks to space. Now, if you're a space company and your customers are also another space company, great. That's not the case for me. So I think sometimes you can go to all of these events and they're all saying the same thing. You could be at probably 2 conferences a week in this industry if you wanted to. And I have no doubt that there would be the same 50 people, or all of them, from certain organizations. Obviously, there's loads of different ones thrown into the mix as well. But I think it is important to be selective. What I would also say is you can't learn about how to be selective until you go to them and find out that you shouldn't have gone. There are conferences outside of the space sector where I've done that, especially focused on energy transition and net zero. We turn up to it, we're looking to have some great conversations with renewable energy companies, energy storage companies, National Grid, and we end up being told by somebody from one of the big 4, oh, we can help you plan your carbon tax credits. And I'm like, no, that's not the conversation I came here to have. So I guess it's almost beware of a conference for the sake of a conference.
And let's get back to the seed round. That specific event when you meet Dylan and George was very big milestone, I would say, and also an opening door to the next round. But I'm very curious, how did you approach that seed round specifically? How did you approach pitching to, for example, Type 1 Ventures, right? And what was your process there?
Every investment round you do, you learn. And what I would say is that no investment rounds don't get any more difficult than when you first started, but they remain as difficult Now, the reason I say that is because every round has different challenges that you haven't encountered as the stakes increase, as the monetary value increases, and basically as your knowledge base increases. So the things that used to keep me up at night during my pre-seed have been a walk in the park for later fundraising rounds. So certainly don't underestimate that. In terms of how I approached the seed round, to be honest, I didn't really have an approach because my pre-seed, BPEC were the first investors that I spoke to, and they invested. And then because they invested, Development Bank of Wales invested. So I only spoke to 2 investors at the pre-seed stage, and I got 2 yeses. So I didn't have an approach in terms of like, well, systematically, I need to hit these investors at this point with this kind of story. Now, what I will say is what that allowed me to do is waste a lot of other investors' time that I knew probably wouldn't invest in me because they were in the wrong kind of thing, but allowed me to hone my pitch. So I did an extraordinary number of pitches at the seed round to get my story right. And that number was 150 different investors before I got my first yes at seed stage. I think now investors exist in these types of categories, whereas they didn't really. I mean, deep tech as a term has been so bastardized so many people say that they do deep tech, but actually it just turns out they do fintech SaaS. So that has been one of the major shifts is there are now deep tech investors who are actually doing deep tech. So I wasted a lot of time on people that said they did deep tech, but really only ever did software. That's not to say that there isn't deep tech software, but they did, the usual stuff. So now that I know that class of investors exists, I know where to spend my time. Also, because that is naturally quite a small pool, given the industry, I know from the sorts of companies that they've invested in, from what they might talk about, from their own podcasts or whatever it might be, what they're interested in and what they respond well to. And that's been one of the great lessons going into the Series A, is thinking about investors far more strategically than I did at the seed round. Now, at the seed round, that's also because it was 2021. The market was pretty heady. It wasn't quite as frothy as early 22. But there were plenty of people piling into space as a sector that I wouldn't be surprised if now don't do space deals. We found the gems in that 2021 market, certainly. And I know people that didn't. Because I did that many pitches, by the time I came to speaking with people who would have a direct interest, I was in a much better position to communicate around what we were doing, what the round would do for us, why it mattered to them, why it would get them a great return. And what then happened was, Type 1 was entirely spontaneous. So Type 1 came about from a random LinkedIn message that put me in touch with them. And I did a pitch to them, to Tarek, the founding GP, and we got on well. It was a good conversation. And he called me about 30 minutes later and he went, right, we think you're great. We want to lead your seed round. He said, one problem. It's not big enough. So at the time, I was looking to raise £1 to £2 million, which back then I think was probably about the going rate for a UK seed round. So he said, you need to be doing at least 6. So I was like, okay. He was like, and I'm going to help you get you there. So he then was able to introduce us to an enormous American VC ecosystem that, to me, apart from having already met like Dylan and George and Mike Mealing from Starbridge, was basically an untapped resource. And the classic, you need a warm introduction. So this is where the difference comes in between opportunity and kind of network effect, is you've got to have the right access to the right people to get you in front of them. And that just lit a fuse under that seed round.
Last point in fundraising, I would love to tap into any fuck-ups from the period of fundraising.
I mean, loads. I think probably the main one that I learned is basically sometimes an investor isn't right. And them disagreeing with you, it's almost like a fundamental law of nature. You're not going to be able to onboard everybody. That's okay. I have had some crazy things said to me from investors that did not participate in Spaceforge's rounds. And it makes you question yourself. whether or not you're on the right path. You question whether or not you need to change your pitch, you question whether or not you need to consider something different about the aspects of the technologies that you might be working on. Sometimes you just meet investors who just don't understand what it is that you do. And that's okay. So I think really my biggest fuck up was spending far too much time with investors that actually I was never going to convince in the first place. And that's why I still think as much as a yes is wonderful, the second best thing after a yes is a very quick no. To provide an anecdote around it, I pitched an investor in the UK that didn't come in at the seed round. For a start, they wanted 50% of the company for a £1 million investment, which was obviously all not going to fly. And I got to the data rooms. I got to the data room stage and I sent them a data room, and I think I used Notion or something like that, and put it all in there so I could see if they'd been in on it and what they'd visited. In the 2-week time that they were digging in, nobody visited the data room. And they came back to me and they were like, Josh, we think you're building something really fantastic here. We think it's multi-generational. We think this has the ability to be enormous. However, your technology is quite risky, and the return on investment, provided it works, is very high. For that reason, we're out. For them to have described what is the venture capital asset class, risky with the opportunity of a very high return, and then say for that reason they're out, that's quite a bewildering thing to go through as a founder. And it just demonstrates basically the contrarian nature of being in the venture capital and the deep tech landscape. You will find people who don't understand what you do. That's okay.
As a former founder, I had the same thing. When I got no, I was so sad. And I had this moment of questioning what we are doing, if this is the right thing. But at the end of the day, there are always people that will believe in you at some point.
And I think that deep tech as a whole, that's the important thing. You can basically never be late to deep tech. You're either too early or you're right on time. And that's going to be the question you get asked the most, is basically why now? And as long as you can answer that question, you're going to be able to steamroll ahead.
Okay, cool. We covered the fundraising, and now we get into the business development, especially the scaling part of it. If I got it right, Spaceforge went from a team of 15 to 40 full-time staff between 2021 and 2022. What were the biggest operational challenges you faced during this rapid growth as a first-time founder?
It's been even more intense. I think overall, going from 50 to 60 people was harder than going from 2 to 50, because you start to get to a size of company where you don't see everybody every day in the same way that you do when you're smaller. I think the most foundational lesson in building a team is building a culture early. The beauty of working on something like Spaceforge is that there is a unifying mission and a unifying purpose to it. And in the kind of genesis of the company, that is something that everybody can rally behind. And it's then very important that as you grow, you have to maintain that unifying vision, as well as bringing in the things that, almost on a process level, allow you to do the things a company has to do, even at a base level, to be compliant with things like the law. But also to ensure that unity is there in the actions of the individual and the actions of a team that drive toward that vision. So one of the things that we did at Spaceforge quite early on is we codified some cultural values when we only got to I think we got to like 8 people, maybe 9 people when we set some cultural values. And we came up with 5 of them. Those cultural values basically define the behaviors of the company. What they also do is they act as like our reward and our measurement metrics as well internally. So if somebody does something great, then we flag them for that associated cultural value. They might get like a reward or something, or just like the team, when they sing their praises of the other team members or the wider company, can tag a cultural value, even as base level in our Slack channels, and say, yes, that exhibited one of the Spaceforge values. Big tick, check. But the value that I'm probably most proud of in doing a deep tech company is failure of the month.
Okay, so what was the failure of last month?
What was last month's failure? No, I do remember last month's failure, but that one should probably stay internal. I have several favorites.
Oh yeah, sure.
One of my favorites was one of our team, we were experimenting with an alloying payload during COVID pandemic. So we were working in garages, bedrooms, outhouses, whatever we were allowed to scramble. And he was experimenting with an alloying payload in his flat in Cardiff. And he was trying to build a space qualifiable payload that could alloy metal. So obviously that requires getting something very hot. What he did was end up melting a hole in his carpet when trying out the alloying payload. So we admired his ambition, and we admired the fact that he did succeed in melting some metal. It's just there was an unfortunate byproduct of that, which was we had to give his landlord the deposit money to pay for the ruined carpet. And one of the other important things I think about failure of the month is, so when we were quite a small team, less than 10, we just used to award it as co-founders. We just used to be like, right, okay, you really mucked up this month. You've won it for that thing you did. As the company's grown, we've brought the entire organization into the nomination procedure. So importantly, failure of the month is self-nominated. So you have to nominate yourself for having failed that month. The people who then think they've achieved the failure of the month put their case forward as to why they deserve the award. And at the company all hands, which we do each month, we all vote on which one we think wins failure of the month. So what's really important about that is it creates that open culture of honesty and transparency. Plus also, if we know that there's a failure that's happened, then we can get to solving it much faster than if we didn't know about it. And I think that's really important. The second really important thing about failure of the month is that every failure that has been a failure of the month has never been repeated. The day that it is repeated is the day I should probably no longer lead the company.
It's a good reflection to have. And by the way, I love the tradition.
I would say as well, what's quite nice is so they all get framed and they're put in the hallway, which you have to walk through to get to the manufacturing floor plate. So you have to walk past all of the failures of the month since, when did we start it? Like November 2020. So they're all hanging there from every month since that point, and you have to walk past all of them before you go start engineering.
One last thing about the scaling up and business development is the first employees. I'm very curious, how did you get your first 5? How did you approach it? And how would you approach it differently now?
So our first, I think we hired like 4 in one go. And they all came from very different walks of life, and they all came from very different parts of the world. So we pride ourselves on how international an organization we are at Spaceforge. So across our team, we represent something like 23 different countries. We were obviously during COVID, during our first hires, so that limited the ability to do anything much in person. And we had the traditional sort of like just 2-stage interview process to start off with, do an interview. Do we think you might work well with us? Great. Okay. Let's assess your technical skill set or whatever skill set you're going to bring to the organization and see whether or not we think you've got the requisite experience to come and join us. But that morphed into us doing a cultural value interview. So those values of Spaceforge basically influence the questions at the first stage for us to see, one, whether or not you actually like the cultural values and think you could work well with the team as much as it is for the team to think that they could work well with you. And then the second interview is into that kind of technical experience or engineering experience or business side experience, depending on the sector or whatever department that you might be going into. So we hired several people at the start, as I say, from very different walks of life. So the first person we ever interviewed was Anna, who is the lead on our heat shield. She came from Brazil with a degree in engineering and a master's in space law, and had also done an analog mission on behalf of Brazil as a potential future astronaut. So she was the first person that we wanted to onboard and wanted to hire, not least because when she did her technical interview with us around how she would design some of the re-entry technology, she had a 10-minute slot to present. And when she brought up her PowerPoint, it was like 140 slides. And we braced ourselves for like, oh my God, how on earth is she going to get through this? What it turned out was basically instead of doing like animations and stuff and layering it on the slide, she just moved through the slides to demonstrate the animation. But to watch somebody go through 140 slides in 10 minutes and it to be coherent and like a logical approach and a logical conclusion as to the engineering challenge we'd set her, like blew us away. However, When you are two guys in a garage and you're speaking to somebody
Oof.
in Brazil that you're trying to onboard into a UK startup, we were not prepared for the UK Home Office and what it takes to get a visa approved. So even though we interviewed Anna and offered her the job, it took 7 months for us to do everything with the Home Office to get her from Brazil and into Spaceforge. We're now much better at the Home Office proceedings, and we now tend to get our visas approved the same day that we ask for them. But that was a very strange way to do your first hire, but an excellent learning curve for all the other international people we brought on.
I love your sense of international culture and also employee base. Regarding going international, recently I've opened offices in the US. I wanted to get into trying to find an advice for other founders that are thinking about expanding into the US market, and what would be the highlights that you would definitely want to
Find
mention to
the
them?
right state to put your operation in is probably the best piece of advice that I could give. So, I mean, pretty much every state has got some quantum of space work going on inside of it. But if it's not the right space work, then you might put yourself in the wrong position. So each state basically has its own strengths. Also then, as many listeners will already know, each state has its own laws, its own taxes, its own various jurisdictions that you may need to be aware of, or may also offer you all sorts of advantages when it comes to different agreements. So that's one of the reasons why we're in Florida, is because at a state level, it has agreements with the UK when it comes to the export from the UK to Florida of space goods, which basically means it's much easier to launch from Florida than it is if you choose other launch sites. So I mentioned that somewhat anecdotally. The other major thing I think to be aware of is the cost of doing business in America. Salaries in space engineering compared to the UK are 5 times higher. So every time we hire somebody in America, I know that roughly for a comparable position, I could hire 5 engineers in the UK. And that's a difficult mind shift for the European founder to get their head around.
What is the right time to expand? A very basic question, but very hard answer, I can imagine. And it depends on different contexts. But if you look into the big picture, when do you
Honestly,
think is the right
I
time
don't
to
actually
expand?
think there is one. I think it is entirely company and technology dependent. So if you're working in a supply chain technology, so if we take like one of the supply chain highlights from a venture capital perspective of like propulsion, there are lots of propulsion companies, lots of different propulsion solutions. You might also be working on chemical, you might be working on hybrid, you might be working on electric. Those technologies will be driven by customer demand. So if you see customers in the US signaling a need for a certain type of electric propulsion, that might be the one that you're working on, that might not already be existing in the US, then you probably know it's your time to move and start expanding. Ours was a very different need to that, because as Spaceforge, we straddle the two most geopolitically sensitive markets that there are in terms of space and semiconductors. So for us, the thing that's really driven us to the States is onshoring and CHIPS Act, in terms of what that means for being able to work with American customers that we already have, and the need to have a manufacturing base in the US to be able to serve those customers. Being based in the UK, I've also seen the same thing in Europe with the EU CHIPS Act and our need to put operations into the EU to also be able to serve customers of the EU. So I think really it's more about keeping your ear to the ground and understanding what the shifts are in the technology area that you're working on that might need you to make that move.
I love your approach based on what you need, right? Instead of
Yeah.
trying to go there because people are talking about it within your environment, etc. Okay, cool. Amazing. We have covered some amazing points regarding fundraising and scaling up and hiring. I would love to get into the present moment and just out of the curiosity, explore what you're up to in Spaceforge now and where are you going from this point?
We are up to way too much at the moment. I mean, expansion has been, it's been an incredible thing to be part of. as I mentioned earlier, so, one of the challenges was like it was more difficult growing from 50 to 60 people than from 2 to 50, not least because of the pressure that's now on our current industrial unit. We are bursting at the seams with both the amount of people that we have working on site at any one time. We're having to ask our neighbors if they mind us using spare places in their car parks for us to park in. We have so much active work on right now, the equipment that has arrived for work that we will very soon be working on. We don't have the room to even unbox it until we finish the current projects. So that has all been an intense learning period. We are awaiting regulatory approval to be allowed to launch one of our upcoming missions. And I am now actively working on, what are we up to? I say the team are working on, I think we're working on 5 different payload opportunities at the moment. So next year, fingers crossed, we'll be going to space at least 5 times, possibly all the way out to 10, maybe more, with different missions that we're working on across a suite of both making semiconductors in space and demonstrating the re-entry technology. At the same time, we are also scaling our semiconductor pilot line, where we're already producing materials for some of our customers. The 2 that are public are Northrop Grumman and BT, British Telecom. So as a company, as I said earlier, right at the start, we're already making semiconductor materials. They are going out the door and to our customers to start using in their pilot programs and R&D teams to start seeing what sort of benefit they can get at a system level.
And if we look into the long-term future, what is your ultimate vision that you want to make happen? How the world is going to be a better place thanks to Spaceforge? How do you see that?
So when I think long term, I only think out to about 2035. And the reason I only think out to about 2035 is I roughly think that's going to be the year when making things in space is boring. So when we think about, the advent of the personal computer, and I'm sure you'll remember being a kid and getting your first family computer, and that was incredible. Now, when you go back and visit your parents, they're both sat there on their own tablets or their own smartphones while the TV's playing. And there is more power in that smartphone than was in your first family desktop. And so the advent of personal computing very quickly became just a thing, basically, that's just always there. And we take it extraordinarily for granted. If I can get making semiconductors in space to be as boring as that, then I have succeeded. So when you open up your laptop and you see Intel inside, I want to be in a position where you see Spaceforge from inside. I basically want to be building Apple, but from space.
When did you get this vision, by the way? Because it's very clear where you're going, and vision is the way how you communicate on what are you doing and where you want to end.
The first ever tagline that we had as Spaceforge was saving the fucking planet. And people did not really respond as well to that. They just thought we were trying to be edgy for the sake of being edgy. And then eventually we workshopped some stuff and came up with the Making Space Work for Humanity tagline. The reason I want to become that company is because it solves 2 of the most pressing, generational issues that we have right now. The first of those is everybody wants to improve their quality of life without damaging the environment. Right now, that is basically an impossibility. And as living standards rise globally, as we adopt more and more technology, so does the drain on the finite natural resources of our planet. In shifting, as a first step, the production of some of that technology in space from Earth to space allows us to start the production of things which, when returned to Earth, offer things like significant energy savings, size savings, weight savings, which then fundamentally drive overall system improvements. It means that we can drive a technology approach to raising the standards of living across, pretty much any sector that depends on semiconductors, and that's pretty much all of them, in a way that doesn't further harm the finite natural resources that we have here. The second of those is that if you can drive that performance improvement high enough, you can be in a position where what you do in space is actually climate positive. To condense all of that, into something that somebody will quickly understand and resound with, you start thinking about the things that they carry in their pocket. Everybody pretty much carries a smartphone. Apple is a recognized brand. Apple also has a fantastic approach to vertical integration of the technology from the semiconductor all the way up the value chain. So when I say I want to build the technology that allows us to become Apple from space, if I can start with the material, I can work with our partners, and then together we can deliver entire products which change that balance.
Very inspiring. All right. Time
Okay.
for some rapid fire questions. Let's get into them. One book or resource that every founder in space or defense should
If
read.
I was going to give you the boring answer, I would say Chip War. If I was going to give you an answer that's far more personal to me, I would say read the trilogy called His Dark Materials.
The most surprising thing you have learned about working in space manufacturing.
How much of the job is not engineering spacecraft?
Okay, good. Now let's time to be more actionable. If there are any early stage founders out there listening, especially those struggling to get their first funding round, what's the one piece of advice you wish you had known when you were in their shoes right now in this environment?
I think it's to have persistence. And I would add to that, there are founders now that exist because Spaceforge exists. And we've seen like almost a cohort come up behind us in the UK that have said, and there's no way of this sounding anything but bragging, and I apologize. But I've had founders come up to me and say, like, because you gave it a go, we were willing to give it a go. So I would say to the early stage founders that are listening, like, please reach out to me. I would love to help if there's some way that I can.
Thanks so much for this chat and for this very first episode. It has been actually a goldmine of insight, especially
having me.
within fundraising and hiring. So thanks a lot. Before we wrap this up, do you have any final thoughts you have on your mind right now?
Only that I think the work in this sector is probably the most important work that you could be doing right now. And I say that to the founders and the investors listening across Europe, that it is so bloody important that we keep doing this. And I guess it's almost to just say thank you for all the work that you yourself are doing, but also I think that everybody listening is doing to make this an important step for Europe.